Scientists are urging Australians to help stop the silent extinction of insects and other invertebrates, with nearly 1,000 species now under threat. Invertebrates Australia and the Biodiversity Council say small actions like planting native flowers, ditching pesticides and recording sightings can make a big difference. They warn that losing these creatures could collapse ecosystems and threaten food production.
If you are cute and furry, you tend to get a bit of attention, but the time has come to shine a light on some of our smaller creatures which are doing it tough and may not be getting the attention they deserve. I'm talking about our bees, butterflies and bugs. They do a lot of good work, but sadly, around 1,000 Australian invertebrates are facing the threat of extinction and they need our protection. There are a few things we can do to help the plight of these invertebrates. Kate Umbers is an associate professor in zoology at Western Sydney University and is a huge fan of all these little critters. Hello, Kate.
Hello, thanks for having me.
What sort of challenges are our invertebrates facing?
Well, they're facing all the big ones. So, of course, climate change, pesticide use, habitat destruction, invasive species. You know, these are common things that we hear repeated time and time again in conservation as the main threats to biodiversity.
Yeah, I mean, my youngest is absolutely animal obsessed. In fact, she would love to meet you. I'm sure she'd love to be a zoologist. And she spends a lot of time, you know, not only with larger animals and the snake that she's got, but with insects in the garden and finding geckos and finding gecko eggs and carefully looking after insects. But it does feel like when I was a kid, there were more in the garden than there are now.
Yeah, look, this is one of the more specific threats for invertebrates is that, you know, we actively discourage interactions with these species sometimes. And sometimes we can pass on unnecessary fears to our kiddos around these critters, which actually disrupts their connection with nature. And it's a really big problem because we start out loving them. And something happens to us around, you know, when we, you know, oftentimes when we start to grow up, you see little tiny kids loving things. And then all of a sudden it's ew and ah. And, you know, where does this come from? And what can we do to prevent that disconnection? But, yeah, certainly it's widely reported that insects are in decline, invertebrates more generally, and these patterns, you know, they wobble around a bit. But overall, it's very clear that, like all of biodiversity, we're seeing far fewer individuals and we are seeing far fewer species now.
Do you think they get overlooked because they are small and we think of them as being plentiful? We just think there are so many of them?
No, it's a funny one, isn't it? You know, it's sort of the million-dollar question for us in invertebrate conservation. Why exactly is it that we see less conservation attention towards these critters? Because it doesn't actually make a lot of sense. You know, we love them. They're in our gardens. They're all around us. You know, we're talking about things like butterflies and dragonflies. You know, these are amazing creatures that everybody thinks are beautiful. So it is a bit of a conundrum. And, you know, I think it's something that we can easily shift by simply spending time with these little critters when we come across them in our daily lives. You know, if you walk outside, maybe you're waiting for the bus, you see an ant walking along, the pavement, spend a little time with it, see what it does, you know, check it out. Maybe it's carrying something.
Yeah, they are amazing. I wish I could do what an ant does, build a bridge and carry, you know, however many times my body weight of stuff. I mean, they're incredible.
They really are. And you know, I think we actually do know that, and somehow we forget it. And I think, you know, one of our big jobs is just to remind people of how absolutely amazing these little critters are.
I'm talking to Associate Professor Kate Umbers. She's a professor in zoology at Western Sydney University, just about what we can do, I guess, to help look after all these little critters that are in our gardens, in the environment, and unfortunately many of them are at risk. How do we benefit by having lots of invertebrates in the environment around us, Kate?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things that we benefit from are these sort of everyday connections to nature. When we see these animals, the little bee visiting a flower, you know, we know that there's really important human health, mental health benefits from having these creatures around us. The other way that we benefit from them, of course, is all of the really important jobs that they do in the ecosystems. You know, they're pollinating all of some huge proportion of our food. You know, there's many crops that are utterly pollination dependent. Also, you know, decomposing waste. The snails, for example, are composting the forests as they munch the leaf litter and all of those sorts of things. So, you know, functionally, it's just obvious that these things are really, really important. But there's also these less obvious benefits to humans around, you know, the joy that they bring.
How hard is it to gauge what we've lost then when it comes to invertebrates?
It's both easy and hard. You know, some people around the world are measuring these things very directly. some amazing studies coming out of Germany with decades of counting bugs in flowering meadows and things like that. In Australia, we don't invest in our biodiversity monitoring nearly enough, and so we don't have very clear data, like in terms of the really kind of strict scientific sense. But you'd be hard pressed to find somebody that would say, "Oh yeah, we've got roughly the same number of Christmas beetles as we've always had." I don't see any major difference in the number of Christmas beetles we've got these days, because that's a really, really common story. So one of the ways that we're measuring insects and how many are around and what we've got now compared to what we used to have is to ask people about their memories. We can do lots of really interesting science on what people know now, what they remember, what their parents remember, those sorts of stories, and we can reconstruct the past from human perception.
We often talk about the ways to attract birds to our gardens, but what can we do to help the invertebrates?
Look, the great news is that a lot of the actions that we can do to attract birds and other creatures that perhaps I'm more familiar with are the same. We can plant flowering plants with resources, spiky things, all that sort of stuff, and native ones where we can, which is always a really good option. We can provide water. We can have a messy garden, where we've got logs and all those sorts of things lying around to make the habitat complex so more things can find a spot.
Oh, yeah, this is one of my child's favourite things to do, is go into our messy garden and lift things up and discover what's underneath them.
That's it. It's wonderful. It's wonderful, and we should be absolutely encouraging it. Obviously, in Australia, we have to be a little bit careful because every now and then we might come across a critter that's not safe. But the absolute, by and large, interactions we're going to have with animals in our gardens is going to be safe and fascinating and wonderful. And the other thing we must all try to do whenever ever possible is cancel our broad spectrum sprays, and avoid pesticides wherever we possibly can, because these things are killing a lot of species that we're not intending to, and making our gardens these kind of sterile green spaces with nothing much alive.
Other than the grass. Well, what are a few of the invertebrates? This isn't a funny topic at all, but what are a few of the invertebrates that were once widespread but are harder to spot now?
Yeah, well, Christmas beetles is one of our big examples where people have noticed that they're, where are all the Christmas beetles? Why aren't they hitting my fly screen in December, as I kind of watch the cricket or whatever? So that's kind of a conspicuously absent species. The bogong moth is bouncing around all over the place. Its population, crashed spectacularly in 2017 and seems to be slowly recovering. But they're still endangered because they rely on the alpine regions of Australia staying cold despite climate change, which is obviously very problematic. So there's a couple of really kind of high-profile examples like that most Australians are kind of either aware of, or once you point it out, people go, "Oh yeah, gosh, now that you mention it."
Yeah.
Haven't seen one in a while.
Just back to the bogong moth, I spotted a fascinating story out this morning about migrating bogong moths under the stars and Earth's magnetic field to find their way where they need to go. You've obviously heard about this. How does it work?
Yeah, it's fabulous. Well, how it works is a very complex neurobiological story. But yeah, it's wonderful. They're able to use the Milky Way as kind of a large kind of streak in the sky to orient direction. They seem to have some kind of innate information, that is information that's somehow genetically coded about what direction they should fly. And they can use the Milky Way to orient, and also the Earth's magnetic field. It's really, really marvellous for such a tiny little critter.
Oh, it's fascinating. Keep going.
Oh, the really important thing for our West Australian listeners is that we really, really need observations from Western Australia, because it's not impossible, and we're looking into this, it's not impossible that bogong moths are flying all the way from Perth to the Snowy Mountains.
Whoa!
Yes, we're looking into whether or not this is the case, and if people are in Perth in Western Australia and they're keen to help us answer this question, get on iNaturalist. Anytime you see a little brown moth, take a picture just in case it's a bogong moth. We desperately need observations from Western Australia.
Just, Kate, say that again. Where do we need to get onto?
There's a wonderful app called iNaturalist, which helps people identify everything they see in the living world. And you can upload a photo there. And we use it for all kinds of research projects. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource for scientists to kind of centralize observational data on all the different species around the world, actually.
And everyone can
Australia,
be a citizen scientist.
Absolutely. It would be so wonderful. Yeah. In Australia, we're one of the top 4 users in the world of this amazing resource.
Kate, thanks for your time this afternoon.
Very welcome.
Kate Umbers is an associate professor in zoology at Western Sydney University, a huge fan of these little critters. And if you want to know more or do more, you can always head to invertebrateaustralia.org. Helen in Tuche says, just a decade ago, we still had bugs hit our car windscreens as we drove country. Hardly any now. And how amazing, those bogong moths that can possibly fly all that way. And a reminder, if you do want to take part, you just need that iNaturalist app and you can take images of what you're seeing in your garden and upload them